All right, so let's continue in verse 11 here. Okay, so it says, when Peter came to Antioch, I withstood him to the face. That's Paul talking. I withstood Peter to this face. Why? Because he was to be blamed. So he did something wrong. Okay, so it goes on in verse 12 to say what he did wrong. Before that, certain men came from James. Peter, he did eat with the Gentiles. Okay, but when they were come, it says he withdrew and separated himself. So he started acting differently. Okay, why did he start acting differently? Why did he withdrew himself and separate himself from eating with the Gentiles all of a sudden? It said, fearing them which were of the circumcision. Who are the circumcision? Those are the Jews, remember? Okay. Christ was a minister of the circumcision. Peter was an apostle to the circumcision, the Jews. All right. So the Jews came, or the Jews were around, and all of a sudden he started acting different. Okay. He separated himself. There was peer pressure. Why? Because he feared the Jews. All right. So in John 7:13, it says, no man spoke openly of him for fear of the Jews. As you can see here, fear of the Jews. Fear of the Jews, right? The religious Jews persecuted people that opposed their doctrine. And Paul and Peter were going to be persecuted for their doctrine because Peter knew better, right? He knew better. He knew Paul's gospel. He knew they were justified by grace through faith, not of works. But when these guys came with their other gospel, right, their other doctrine, as you saw, in Acts 15 when I showed you, those guys said, unless you're circumcised according to the law, you can't be saved. It's needful to circumcise them, command them to keep the law of Moses. All right, and that troubled people. It subverted their souls, troubled with words. James even said, we gave no such commandment for any of that. All right? No such commandment. So, when Peter knows better and he starts acting differently, Paul feels like he has to call him out. Okay, why? In verse 13, it says, other Jews dissembled likewise with him. All right, so the other Jews saw what Peter did, and they did the same thing. Insomuch that Barnabas also was carried away with their dissimulation. What's dissimulation? That's hypocrisy. Okay, right there. Right? People were around Peter. They looked to Peter. Okay? And he started acting differently. He started acting like a hypocrite. And because he started acting like that, because he was afraid, right, he caused other people to act the same way. And see how easy it is to turn away from the truth of the gospel. Because you're afraid of what religious people might say. Because you're afraid of being persecuted for the message of the cross. Peter knew better, but he still went the other way. So in verse 14, Paul says, but when I saw that they walked not uprightly, they're not walking uprightly. They're not walking truthfully in integrity. Now, they're giving in to the false doctrine. Okay, not uprightly according to the truth of the gospel. Okay, and if all it took was Peter not eating with Gentiles now, because he saw these guys and he was afraid of them. How many people you think around the world who listen, to regular preaching, they don't rightly divide the word, read their Bible in context, and they hear it for a minute, and then they hear the mainstream, preaching and teaching, whether it be on YouTube, radio, or just most of the churches, it's so easy for them to get caught up in that. Okay, they will be carried away, as Paul said, very easily unless they diligently study themselves and don't take everybody's word for it, including my own. Very easy to get carried away. All right. So Paul says, I said unto Peter before them all. Right. He's calling him out in front of everybody, saying, and he tells them, if you, being a Jew, now remember, Peter knows better. Right. He knows you're saved by grace through faith, not of works. The Gentiles are saved by grace through faith, not of works. They don't have to follow Jewish customs. They don't have to live by the law to maintain salvation. Right? He says, you being a Jew, you live like a Gentile in the manner of the Gentiles. Why? Because he knows better. Right? He knows he doesn't have to do that. What did he say in Acts? Acts 15:11. But we believe that through the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, we shall be saved, even as they are. So he knew better, and he spoke up and said the truth. He said the right thing here. Okay, but over here, he's not doing that anymore. All right, so he calls him out and says, you live like a Gentile, not as a Jew. How can you tell now Gentiles all of a sudden to follow or live like Jews? Why are you compelling them to live like Jews? What does that mean? That means he's now giving in to this. Unless you're circumcised and keep the works of the law, you'll be cut off. Right? You hear, mainstream Christians today talk like that. And what do? They totally subvert the souls with their false words, with their false doctrine. It's very subtle. But, everybody claps and says, yay, and come on, and preach the truth, brother. Stuff like that. When it's in reality should scare them because they're not doing enough to be saved, unless they think they are, which is self-righteous delusion. He says, why do you compel them to live like Jews when you don't? All of a sudden, right? He switched up. Okay, verse 15. We who are Jews by nature, he's talking about their ethnicity, and not sinners of the Gentiles. So when he says that, he's referring to this prejudice and bias Jews had towards people who weren't Jews. They're called unclean sinners, right? Dogs to the Jews, beneath them. And believe me, they treated them like such. Okay? But Paul says, we who are Jews by nature and not sinners, even we, what? Verse 16, know that a man is not justified by the works of the law. Peter knew that. And he's trying to get Galatians and everybody here to keep understanding that. And he has to. Why? Because what we saw earlier, all right, he wants the truth right here, the truth of the gospel to continue with them. And that's why he gave no place or did not give in to them for one bit. All right? He didn't give in to them because he wanted the truth of the gospel to continue. And if he does give in and he lets Peter give in with his hypocrisy, people aren't going to hold on to this truth. Right? Not justified. That's a big difference from justified. You're either justified or not justified. And if guys are saying, well, it's by works of the law, and it's not by works of the law, people are in big trouble. Okay? Because they're believing a lie. He says, on the contrary, but by the faith of Jesus Christ. That's what saves. That's what makes people justified. Even we have believed in Jesus Christ that we might be justified. How are you justified? By the faith of Christ. How are you not justified? By trying to keep commandments and maintain your salvation through your works. This whole maintaining thing, well, how do I maintain my salvation? Anybody who says that preaches this, a works gospel that doesn't justify. Okay, plain and simple. They can dance around it and do all kinds of mental gymnastics and quote all kinds of verses out of context. But if you're saying works play a part in your salvation, or you're saying it doesn't, but then you say, I maintain my justification by this, you're not preaching the truth. Okay? This is how you're justified. Faith. Right? Faith to faith. That's what Romans 1:17 says. It starts with faith and it ends with faith. He says again, not by the works of the law. That means works. I don't care if you're following the 10 commandments or you just have a works, mindset in your head that you have to do a certain amount. Like you keep a scale or you register all your works to see if you think you're good enough for salvation. People do that. Sounds crazy, but they do it. For by the works of the law, no flesh shall be justified. No flesh. Nobody. Nobody will be justified by the works of the law. Okay, so he gives a clear description right here. What justifies? Faith of Jesus Christ. What doesn't justify? And so Peter knew better than this. That's why he's calling him out in front of everybody. He knew better. And yet he, because of peer pressure, because he felt like people who were, he felt inferior to for some reason, concerning religious things, he gave into it. And that's tough. Because that's a guy who walked with the Lord. That's a guy who walked with Paul. He knew better, and he did this. Now, anybody could do this. It's not just Peter. It's peer pressure, right? You don't want to be persecuted for the message of the cross. You don't want to be persecuted for anything. Who does? But that's what happened here, okay? So, verse 17. But if, while we seek to be justified by Christ, okay, we ourselves are found sinners, what does that mean? What does it mean? What is he talking about when he said found sinners? Well, if you sin, yeah, you want to be justified by Christ, that's what justifies you, faith. But if you sin after, or you see sin in your life, right? And that's what the law calls out, sin. That's why he's bringing this up. The law calls out sin. The law says you're sinning, here comes punishment. Okay? It doesn't say when you do good, it says when you do bad. So he says, we ourselves, if we are found sinners, is therefore Christ the minister of sin? Or does his gospel, the gospel of Christ that Paul preaches, does it promote sin? Okay? Because that's what he's getting accused of a lot. Right? You talk to the average guy and you tell him, salvation is by grace through faith, not of works. It's by faith alone. They say, well, what are you saying? You could just live however you want? You always get that response from people. Oh, so I could just go sin and do whatever I want, huh? Like this sarcastic response from people, a mocking response. Oh yeah, Christ wants you to go, live in sin. Oh, shall I continue in sin so that grace may abound? Remember, they asked Paul that. Let me pull it up. Okay, Romans 6:1. What shall we say then? Shall we continue in sin so that grace may abound? Right? Because grace abounds when people sin. Right? God is gracious. He helps them. Just because you sin doesn't mean, you're done according to the law. We're not under the law anymore. What are we under? We're under grace. So there's a difference there. And so that brings up the question, shall we continue in sin so that grace may abound? Because the accusation comes up. So he says, if while we seek to be justified by Christ, we are found sinners, or found sinning, sin in our members, does that mean Christ promotes sin? God forbid. That means no, in the strongest possible way. Okay? So he's facing accusations. He's confronting Peter and those who are being hypocrites in order that the truth of the gospel might continue with them. Okay? He's not giving in. Just because Peter's giving in and Barnabas is led astray, okay, doesn't mean he's going to. And that's why he calls them out here.
All right, so continuing, verse 18. For if I build again the things which I destroyed, I make myself a transgressor. What Paul's talking about here is he can't go back to the old way, right? The old system, the old under the law type of lifestyle, mentality, accepting those things, the old gospel, okay? He doesn't want to rebuild that. And what was that like for him? Okay, Philippians 3:4, he had confidence in his flesh. That's where he had his confidence at, in his flesh. That's what the law, you have to keep the works of the law in order to have your righteousness. So in order to do that, a lot of people put their confidence in their flesh that they can get the job done, right? And all these things he did: circumcise the 8th day, stock of Israel, tribe of Benjamin, Hebrew of Hebrews, touching the law, a Pharisee, zeal, righteousness, which is in the law, blameless. He says all those things he counted a loss for Christ. There's no comparison, he says. The excellency of the knowledge of Christ Jesus my Lord. All right, so Paul says he doesn't want to rebuild those things. Verse 19, for I, though the law, I am dead to the law. For I, though the law, am dead to the law. So he's dead to the law now, meaning he doesn't operate under that system anymore. Why? So that he could live unto God. He says there's life, a better way than being under that performance-based system. If you go to Romans 7, he says, know you not, brethren, I speak to them that know the law, how that the law has dominion over a man as long as he lives. Okay? But in verse 6, he says, but now we are delivered from the law. Now you have people out there that say, why can't you follow God's law? Why can't you keep the commandments? They're not burdensome, right? But they don't understand that the law produces covetousness, or it arouses the sinful nature, right? He says we are to be delivered from that we should serve in the newness of the Spirit. That's a better way. Not in the oldness of the letter. What was the oldness of the letter? The law is simple. Do this, don't do that. And basically the law is saying, do good deeds, don't sin. Right? And you will have righteousness. In Deuteronomy 6:25 it says, and it shall be our righteousness if. That means it's dependent on something. You're righteous if you observe to do all these commandments. Do. That means do the good works. Okay? Action. Faith without deeds is dead. Well, under this performance-based acceptance under the law, you had to do works. Keep the commandments. And that's how you were righteous. It will be our righteousness. Paul says he's dead to that. Dead to that. He's not operating under that anymore. And that means in your mind you're not operating under that. And that means you live and have life differently. Okay? And let me pull this up. Now read verse 9 right here. For I was alive without the law. The law doesn't give life. The law is perfect, yes. God's law is perfect, but people don't keep the law. It works against them. Like I showed you in 1 Corinthians 15, the strength of sin is the law. So he says, when the commandment came, sin revived. The commandment came, sin revived, or came to life. sin revived and came to life. That's exactly what Corinthians teaches. The strength and power of sin is the law. And what happened? He died. It means spiritual death. He didn't physically die. Okay? He says in verse 10, the very commandment, or the commandment which was ordained to life, found to be unto death. So this is a life or death situation in terms of spiritual. Okay, spiritual life, spiritual death. Think about that. This is a life or death matter concerning your spirit. Right? Because it says, sin taking occasion by the commandment deceived me. Right? And that's the deception going on in the church. Preaching that way, teaching things under the law. And they don't even realize they're doing that. They say they aren't, but they are. And it says he slew me. Or it slew me. Okay? The law is holy, but people aren't. They don't keep it. All right, so let's go back to Galatians 2:19. I am dead to the law, that I might live unto God. So come out from that. And he's telling these people, Galatians and all them, come out from that. Don't go back to that. Even if Peter's acting like a hypocrite, don't do that. All right, verse 20. I am crucified with Christ. Nevertheless, I live. Right? This whole thing has to do with life and death. You have spiritual life when you come under Paul's gospel, under grace. Grace is a good thing. Grace strengthens people. It's not a license to sin like people accuse. But if you do sin, his grace abounds. You're not cut off or fallen from grace. Right? What does the Bible say fallen from grace is? Let me show you. So in Galatians 5:4 it says, Christ has become no effect unto you. So his sacrifice is meaningless to you. If what? If you are trying to be justified by the law or by works. Who needs Jesus Christ if you could do it yourself and you have that mentality? That's what it says is fallen from grace. Those people who do that. Okay? That's what's fallen from grace. Typical people, most people think, oh, he sinned, he fell from grace. That's not true. This is how you fall from grace. Trying to be justified by your works. Right? It says, I'm crucified with Christ, nevertheless I live, yet not I, but Christ lives in me. So Christ lives and works through him. He has the Spirit of God. And the life which I now live, I live in the flesh. Now he's not talking about living in the flesh like sin and all that. He's talking about physically, in his physical body. Okay? There's more than just the flesh of the sinful nature. Right? It says, I live by faith, by the faith of the Son of God. So the just shall live by faith. That's what the Bible teaches. Who loved me and gave himself for me. He sacrificed for him. Okay, last verse in chapter 2, verse 21. I do not frustrate the grace of God. This is frustrating to God. It's annoying. Why? Because he's trying to accomplish something and get it through people's head. What? Grace. The grace of God. Okay? He's trying to do that. And what are people doing? Frustrate. To set aside. To violate. To annul. Okay? Nullify. Right? They're just setting it aside. They're striving, contending against it, instead of just accepting it. People do that when they teach, right, this other gospel that these Jews, religious zealots, are trying to teach. It frustrates the grace of God. Okay, that's what arrogance does. You try to help somebody, you try to get it through their head they need help, and they don't want to hear it. right? They do it their own way. That's frustrating in this situation to the grace of God, okay? Because God paid a heavy price. He gave up his son to save people freely and completely. Continuing, it says, if righteousness comes by the law, right, instead of just the free gift of the grace of God, right, who gave himself for me, it says, if righteousness comes by the law, Christ is dead in vain. That means for nothing, right? There's no point. What he went through all that just so you could say, well, you're saved and maintain your salvation by works, okay, without cause. What's the point? All right, so that's frustrating. It makes Christ's sacrifice of no effect. All the suffering he went through, no effect if people teach a doctrine contrary to the grace or the gospel of the grace of God. All right, and that you have plenty of that. Like I keep saying, you have plenty of that in church teaching this. And they say they're not, but they are if you listen to their words. Okay, so that's chapter 2. I'll continue in chapter 3 next video.